recently saw the Eternal Might Precon and thought, zombies are cool, maybe I'll buy that. Then I looked at the list. It's a little bit all over the place. So before actually buying the deck, I wanted to try my hand at upgrading it just to see what that would look like. What I ended up with is actually a really solid zombie deck. This video is about Temmet Naktamun's Will. He's a fairly standard typal commander with a penchant for zombies. An Esper 5 mana 4/4 with Vigilance and Menace, Temmet prioritizes a go-wide zombie strategy with card draw and pump in the command zone. The secondary commander is Hashaton's Scarabs Fist. A 2 mana 1/3, Hashaton wants you to discard creature cards to then copy them when they hit the graveyard for 3 mana. This allows you to play practically any creature cards in Esper colors, but he's really strongest when he's copying expensive creatures and doesn't care about zombies specifically. That isn't this deck. The quality of the cards in this deck are pretty good. Architect has the deck around $145. It's about $50 for the deck itself, so each card is worth roughly $3 a piece. Both commander options are very solid and give two pretty distinct playstyles while still being synergistic. And there are some heavy-hitting zombie cards in this deck, so you're not just playing cannon fodder. I cut 20 cards from this deck and swapped in 20 new ones. I'm pretty confident that you'll like pretty much all of these cuts, maybe 19 of them, but that 20th I think will be a little bit contentious. Stick with me till the end to understand why cutting that 20th card is really important, even if you really don't want to. To start, I'm cutting one land, Terramorphic Expanse. This isn't something I would generally recommend. In fact, you should probably be playing more lands in your decks. However, the difference between 39 and 38 lands is statistically insignificant, so we'll use that card slot for something else. The fixing Terramorphic Expanse offers is useful, but I personally would rather have a card that's coming in untapped, considering we already have a decent number of tapped lands. There are a few cards in here that amass zombies. This isn't a go tall deck though, so I'd much rather have an extra token than stacking power onto only one card. I did leave Gleaming Overseer in the deck because of the protection it offers tokens though. A good example of an army strategy would be Sauron the Dark Lord. I've got a list on my Architect if you want to check it out. I'm cutting basically all of the Eternalized and Embalmed creatures in this deck. These aren't particularly good because the creatures themselves aren't zombies, so they won't be pumped until they can use their ability from the graveyard, but those ability costs are unreasonably high. I mentioned earlier this deck has two directions, zombies and discard. That includes cycling, and I'm cutting all of those cycling cards as well. These are in here mostly for Hashaton's sake, and I want more zombie synergy. Pull from Tomorrow is decent as a pump spell, but I'm iffy on including it. I think there are better draw options that can make the deck a little more consistent, trading some of the explosiveness Pull from Tomorrow might offer. Gate to the Afterlife doesn't really make sense in this deck anymore. You can't use half of the card, and the stipulation to draw doesn't consistently work here because we aren't playing Aristocrats. Maskwood Nexus is cute, but I think it's in here more to keep the price down than to actually synergize with the deck. There are certainly better decks for Maskwood Nexus, like my Rin and Seri deck. You can check it out after this video. It really pains me to cut this card. Like, it's one of my favorites in all of Magic, but Grave Titan is better with Hashaton at the helm. It's unfortunate that Grave Titan isn't a zombie itself because it really likes zombie decks on paper, but because it's a giant, there's just some missing synergy there. Godpharaoh's Gift is too expensive, and I'm trying to recur zombies, not exile them. Again, probably better in Hashaton. Finally, the last of the cuts, I cut Never to Return and Dusk to Dawn. Return is pretty terrible, and Dusk to Dawn is a little too narrow for what I would want that slot to do. That's all of my cuts. Well, almost all the cuts. If you were counting, that was 19, and I told you there were 20. Before getting to that last 20th cut, I think I'm going to save that till the end. Make sure you stick with me till the end because I wanted to talk about this one individually. Let's look at what I'm replacing those 19 cards with. Protecting Temmet is extremely important in this deck. He's the engine for pumping out our little 2/2 zombie tokens into much larger threats. This deck has blue in the color identity, but there isn't a single counterspell, so I added a few. To that end, I also added Lightning Greaves. For whatever reason, they only came in the other Precon. Card draw at instant speed is really good in this deck. RIP Pull from Tomorrow, I might actually be wrong about that one. So I added Corrupted Conviction and Village Rites to have extremely cheap options. This deck is predominantly black, meaning Jet Medallion is the perfect inclusion to get back up to 10 ramp cards. Pumping zombies is what this deck is all about, but sometimes they'll die or you'll get board wiped. Diregraph Captain is an obvious inclusion at only 3 mana to dish out damage and disincentivize people from pointing their removal at you. I found a really cool card from my favorite plane Alara while working on this video. Lich Lord of Unks not only makes you tokens, it also bops someone each turn equal to the number of zombies you've got. Lich Lord of Unks essentially slots into that spot where Gem Palm Polluter was, except you can do it every turn rather than just cycling at once. Phyrexian Arena gives you consistent card draw early in the game, guaranteeing you'll be able to pump with Temmet at least once each turn. Easily the best card you can add to this deck that will be on every single upgrade list you'll find. Verena Lich Queen is made even better by her 4 mana cost. Cast her the turn before Temmet and this deck will run absolutely wild on the board. Her utility really can't be overstated, and you could functionally swap her into the command zone in place of Temmet if you want to switch things up. Another no-brainer, this card will make your deck significantly stronger at the same pace as Verena. Not only does he make it incredibly difficult for people to effectively reduce your board, he also functions as a consistent card draw engine. Although this is on the end step, so it unfortunately doesn't synergize with Temmet. I took out Eternal Skylord, but liked what it brought to the deck. For the same mana cost, Hordewing Scab does the same job, but way better while also providing card draw. There's a decent amount of discard in this deck, meaning it should be pretty good at filling the graveyard. To that end, I added Incarnation Technique, Living Death, and Patriarch's Bidding for recursion. Incarnation Technique provides you with instant gas for your zombie engine, but I'll warn you that it's $10, because it's never been reprinted. I wanted to call it out as a good inclusion, but you should probably wait for the price to drop. Living Death and Patriarch's Bidding are my personal favorites for mass recursion, but you can really swap them out for whatever flavor you prefer in this slot. If you want to learn more about Reanimator decks, check out my Revaz of the Claw deck. Finally, Liliana Dreadhorde General has gotta be my favorite Planeswalker card because of all the utilities she provides. That passive ability is ridiculously good. She slots perfectly into this deck and is also a fun thematic inclusion if you're into that. The utility lands that you put into a deck kind of determine the final direction of it. To be honest, it's probably my favorite part about deck building is deciding what utility lands to add. With that in mind, I wanted to suggest 5 utility lands that you could add to this deck that would definitely make it better. Bojuka Bog is a classic in black decks. There's really no reason not to include it. I feel the same way about most white decks in Minas Tirith. The card draw it provides is great if you need it, and really easy to activate in a token deck. Otherwise, it's just a land. Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, and Tomb Fortress are probably my favorite utility lands in all of Commander. They synergize perfectly off of each other, but also function perfectly on their own. Having the option to mill cards and recur something immediately after is very good on a land, especially if you draw into them later in the game, where increasing your mana pool just becomes less important. I added Westvale Abbey in here as my last land because Ormondal's lifelink can be very helpful if you're starting to dip into the red. I like Westvale in token decks with some death triggers, which this deck certainly has. Now before I talk about that final cut, I want to talk about 5 of my favorite cards from the original deck that I decided to keep. These are cards that kind of hold a unique spot in the deck or just synergize with it overall really well. This is the first meaningful reprint of Zombie Master since 6th edition in 1999. Every reprint since then has been locked behind some kind of hoop to jump through, never before in a standard set. It's only 50 cents, but Forgotten Creation synergizes perfectly with Temmet. It's one of those cards you look at the price tag and say, this thing can't be that good. Then you play it and realize how great it feels in the deck. 3-mana rocks have been getting pushed out of Commander for basically years. However, this 3-mana rock is still cheap enough to cast Temmet a turn early. Credit Crypt is really fun, and it can explode after something like a board wipe to replenish your board instantly. I love God Eternal Oketra, and she functions pretty well in this deck. In my experience, it can be kind of difficult to find a spot for her, but I really like her here. She's a super powerful engine with those 4/4 Vigilance tokens, and is incredibly difficult to remove with her ladder ability. Rothulk falls into a similar category as Zombie Master. It hasn't been meaningfully reprinted until now, and is the biggest bomb in this deck. Words from the wise, try to recur this thing rather than pay for it. You don't have to cast it for its ability to activate, it just has to enter the battlefield. So it's finally time to reveal the last card that I decided to cut from this deck. If you were trying to put the pieces together so far, you're probably not surprised to hear that it's Hashaton Scarab's Fist. Now for some of you, that might be a contentious card to cut. It's 15 bucks, obviously it's really strong, and believe me, I really like the card. I think the card design is awesome. I love that it's like an Orzhov commander, but you have blue included in the text, so it's easier to play, but then the ability is activated after the fact. But the reason that I wanted to cut Hashaton is because this just isn't the best deck that he functions in. Hashaton wants a deck full of like really expensive big monsters that you're discarding to then cheat out for cheap, like Rothulk. He also just doesn't care about zombie typal. He wants to overwhelm people in huge value swings and classic blue manner. such in a way that they just can't keep up. I'm going to make a prediction here, but I think Hashaton will be the strongest commander released in 2025. Now, yes, he works with Temmet, but the value of the cards that you're discarding aren't nearly as high as you want them to be. At 3.49, the mana curve of this deck rounds down to 3, and Hashaton's ability costs 3, meaning you're basically spending 1-to-1 mana for an ability that you're trying to use to cheat out stuff to be a lot cheaper. He really needs a deck that's specifically built around him to function the best he can, and this deck just isn't that. Now, if you agree with me, after this long tirade I've gone on, a good card that you could include instead is Zombie Apocalypse. As a zombie player, it's very thematic and fun to play this card, but it's also a really big swing, potentially killing a bunch of humans, which commanders often are, to recur all of your zombies. If you want to do one even better, Rise of the Dark Realms recurs all creatures in all graveyards onto your battlefield. It's a little bit expensive, but it's worth it. I hope this video is helpful. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or just at me on Twitter. Make sure you check out my Revise of the Claw deck. I'll put it up here shortly. And if you want to see a good deck that works with Maskwood Nexus, I'll pop it up here. Thanks, and until next time, peace.